Warehouse worker Caleb Morris thought his day would end like any other, driving his old gray sedan through Cedar Grove after a long shift. But when the light turned green on Jefferson Avenue, flashing police lights suddenly filled his mirror. Ordered out of the car and searched for matching a description, Caleb stood silently while strangers walked past. Across the street, a student named Lena quietly recorded everything. When nothing illegal was found, the officer drove away. But the truth didn't disappear. Weeks later, that small video forced the city to take a closer look. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. The late afternoon sun hung low above Cedar Grove, a mid-sized American city where life moved just fast enough that most people learned not to look too closely at anyone else's problems. The sky was pale blue, with thin clouds drifting lazily over rows of brick buildings and aging storefronts. A light autumn breeze carried the distant sound of traffic and the faint smell of roasted coffee drifting from cafes along Jefferson Avenue. It was the kind of quiet weekday evening when people were eager to get home, finish dinner, and forget about the day. On that road, Caleb Morris drove slowly through the traffic. Caleb Morris was 38 years old, a tall black man with a lean, work-worn build shaped by years of lifting heavy crates and long hours on his feet. His skin was deep brown, his face narrow with strong cheekbones and a square jaw softened by faint lines of exhaustion that had settled there over time. His hair was short and tightly trimmed, almost military neat, and his dark brown eyes carried a quiet, careful awareness of the world around him. He was the kind of man who rarely raised his voice. Friends who knew him described Caleb as patient, sometimes too patient. He had learned early in life that calmness was often the safest choice. Growing up in a small working-class neighborhood on the edge of Cedar Grove, he had watched his father lose jobs and opportunities for reasons no one openly explained. That experience shaped him. Caleb became the kind of man who avoided trouble whenever possible. Not timid, just careful. At the moment, he sat behind the wheel of his old gray sedan, a 12-year-old car with faded paint and a small dent near the back bumper from a parking lot accident years ago. The engine hummed steadily beneath him, the familiar sound of a machine that had survived long commutes and long winters. Caleb rested one hand loosely on the steering wheel. His mind was already drifting toward home. He had just finished a long shift at a warehouse on the industrial side of the city, a place filled with tall metal shelves, forklifts buzzing across concrete floors, and the steady rhythm of loading trucks. The job was physically demanding, but it paid the bills. Caleb never complained about the work itself. What he looked forward to most at the end of the day was the quiet. A small apartment, a warm meal. Maybe the sound of an old jazz record playing softly in the background. Nothing dramatic. Just peace. As he approached the intersection of Jefferson Avenue and Maple Street, the traffic light ahead changed from red to green. Caleb pressed the gas pedal gently. The sedan rolled forward. Cars moved through the intersection in smooth, ordinary motion. A delivery truck rumbled through the opposite lane. A cyclist waited at the corner. A couple walked along the sidewalk with grocery bags swinging lightly at their sides. Everything felt normal. Just another moment in an ordinary city afternoon. Then, suddenly, red and blue lights flashed in Caleb's rearview mirror. At first, he thought the police car was passing through the intersection behind him, but the flashing lights stayed close, very close. Then came the sound. A sharp police siren cut through the air, loud and cold, echoing against the buildings along Jefferson Avenue. Caleb blinked in surprise. His eyes flicked up toward the rearview mirror again. A police cruiser was directly behind him now, its emergency lights blazing red and blue across the late afternoon sunlight. For a moment, confusion passed across Caleb's face. Had he done something wrong? He mentally retraced the last few seconds in his mind. Speed limit? Normal? Phone? Still in his pocket. Seatbelt, fastened signal, used. Everything had been ordinary, but the cruiser stayed behind him. The siren sounded again. Short. Sharp. clear. Caleb felt a quiet tension tighten in his chest. He eased his foot off the gas. Slowly, carefully, he steered the sedan toward the side of the road and pulled over along the curb. The car came to a stop beneath the shadow of a tall street lamp. For a brief moment, everything was silent again. Then the police cruiser rolled to a stop behind him. The flashing lights painted the street in pulses of red and blue. Caleb sat still in the driver's seat. His breathing slowed. His hands rested quietly on the steering wheel. He had been in situations like this before. Not many, but enough. Enough to know that the next few moments mattered. The door of the police cruiser opened. A man stepped out. The officer walked toward Caleb's car with long, confident strides. His name tag read, Officer Daniel Hargrove. Daniel Hargrove was a white man in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered with the posture of someone used to physical authority. His blond hair was cut short beneath his police cap, and his pale face carried a rigid expression that rarely softened. His jaw was square and tense, and his eyes, light gray and sharp, scanned the scene with a cold, assessing focus. People who had worked with Hargrove often described him as efficient, strict, uncompromising. He believed strongly in order and control, and he rarely questioned his own judgment. At that moment, his gaze was fixed on Caleb. Not curious, not neutral. Decided. Hargrove stopped beside the driver's window. For a brief second, he looked down at the man inside the car. Then he knocked once against the glass. Caleb slowly lowered the window. The cool air from outside drifted into the car. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Hargrove's voice broke the silence. It was short and blunt. "Step out of the vehicle." Caleb blinked once. He had expected questions, license, registration, maybe a simple explanation. Instead, there was only an order. Still calm, Caleb nodded slightly. "All right." He turned off the engine and opened the car door. The metal creaked softly as it swung outward. Caleb stepped out of the vehicle. Standing on the pavement, he was slightly taller than the officer, though his posture was relaxed rather than confrontational. A few passing cars slowed slightly as drivers noticed the flashing police lights, but most continued driving. Jefferson Avenue was still busy, still moving, still indifferent. Caleb took a slow breath. Without being asked again, he lifted his hands, both palms open, both hands visible. It was a small movement, but it came from experience, a habit learned from past encounters. On Caleb's face, there was no anger, no argument, just a quiet, contained weariness. Officer Hargrove studied him for a moment. Then the officer's hand moved. He pointed directly toward the hood of Caleb's car. "Hands on the hood." The command was cold and immediate. Caleb hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Then he nodded again. "Okay." He turned slowly toward the front of the sedan. The metal hood was still warm from the engine. Caleb placed both hands flat against the surface. The evening wind rustled faintly through the nearby trees. Traffic continued moving through the intersection. Behind him, Caleb could hear the officer stepping closer. Heavy boots against the pavement. Measured. Controlled. Caleb stared quietly at the reflection of the sky in the dull, gray paint of his car. He still had not been told why he had been stopped. And in the growing silence of Jefferson Avenue, the moment hung in the air like a question that no one had yet chosen to answer. The green traffic light above the intersection changed again, but Caleb Morris did not move. The metal hood of Caleb Morris's sedan was still warm beneath his palms. The afternoon sun had begun to soften, casting long shadows across Jefferson Avenue, but the tension around him felt sharper than the air. Caleb stood still with both hands pressed flat against the car, his shoulders slightly hunched forward as instructed. Behind him, the sound of Officer Daniel Hargrove's boots approached slowly on the pavement. Officer Daniel Hargrove, whose nameplate glinted in the fading sunlight, had the rigid posture of a man accustomed to control. Up close, his face appeared more severe than it had from a distance. His pale skin was weathered by years of outdoor patrols, and faint creases around his eyes hinted at a man who had spent a long career expecting trouble from strangers. Hargrove's uniform was pressed neatly, every detail aligned with military precision, from the polished badge on his chest to the black utility belt wrapped tightly around his waist. The belt carried the familiar tools of his authority: radio, flashlight, handcuffs, and holstered firearm. He stopped directly behind Caleb. Without warning, Hargrove's hands moved forward, beginning a rough pat-down search. His movements were quick, almost aggressive, as if he were certain that somewhere beneath Caleb's jacket or in the folds of his clothing, there had to be something illegal waiting to be discovered. His hands checked Caleb's shoulders first, then down the arms, then the sides of his torso. The contact was firm, almost forceful. Caleb felt his body shift slightly with each push of the officer's hands. Still, he said nothing. He kept his eyes fixed on the dull reflection of the sky on the hood of the car. The traffic light above the intersection changed again behind him. Cars rolled forward. Life continued moving. But for Caleb, time seemed to slow into small, uncomfortable moments. Officer Hargrove moved quickly, sliding a hand into Caleb's jacket pocket. He pulled the pocket inside out, nothing but a folded receipt from a grocery store and a small set of keys. Hargrove dropped them back carelessly. Then his voice cut through the air. "You match a description." The words were blunt, almost casual, but the tone carried something sharper beneath it. Caleb swallowed. The dryness in his throat surprised him. He kept his voice calm. "Description? Of who, sir?" The question was quiet, respectful, not challenging. But Officer Hargrove did not answer. Instead, the officer continued the search, pressing Caleb forward slightly so that his chest leaned harder against the hood of the car. Hargrove checked Caleb's waistband, his back pockets, the seams of his jeans, and the edges of his belt. Each motion felt less like a question and more like an accusation. Caleb stared down at the hood of the car. His breathing stayed slow. He had learned long ago that even small movements could be misunderstood in moments like this. Across Jefferson Avenue, people continued to move through the intersection. A blue sedan slowed slightly as the driver noticed the flashing police lights. The driver, a middle-aged man with thinning gray hair and thick glasses, looked toward Caleb for a moment. His name was Walter Finch, a retired insurance clerk who had lived in Cedar Grove for more than 30 years. Walter was known among his neighbors as a quiet, polite man who rarely involved himself in other people's affairs. Years of routine had shaped him into someone who believed strongly in staying out of trouble whenever possible. Walter watched the scene briefly. Then the car behind him honked. Walter pressed the gas pedal and drove on. On the opposite sidewalk, a young woman paused near a crosswalk. Her name was Emily Carter, a 26-year-old office assistant who worked at a nearby accounting firm. Emily had straight, chestnut-colored hair that fell to her shoulders and a narrow face framed by thin gold glasses. She was of average height with a slender build and carried a canvas bag over one shoulder filled with documents she planned to review later at home. Emily glanced toward the police car. For a moment, her brow tightened slightly. The scene made her uncomfortable, but Emily had grown up in a household where conflict was always avoided. Her parents believed strongly that problems belonged to other people and that involvement often made things worse. That habit had followed her into adulthood. She looked for only a second longer. Then she turned away and continued walking down the sidewalk. Nearby, a delivery cyclist pedaled past, weaving between parked cars. The rider was Luis Ortega, a young courier barely 20 years old with short dark hair and quick, restless movements that came from years of navigating busy city streets. Luis slowed his bike briefly, curiosity flickering across his face as he noticed the search happening beside the road. But he had packages to deliver, schedules to keep. He pedaled on. Back at the car, Officer Hargrove continued his search. His frustration seemed to grow with every passing second. He checked Caleb's back pockets again, then his jacket, then the inside lining of the coat. Nothing. No weapons, no contraband, no suspicious items. Just ordinary things belonging to an ordinary man. Hargrove stepped back slightly. His eyes narrowed. "Where are you coming from?" the officer demanded. "Work," Caleb answered quietly. "What kind of work?" "Warehouse." Hargrove studied him again. The officer's gaze traveled slowly from Caleb's worn shoes to his shoulders and then up to the back of his head. The silence stretched. Traffic continued to move around them. A bus rumbled past in the far lane. Two teenagers crossed the street at the far corner, laughing about something on a phone screen. The world kept turning, but Caleb felt as if he had been pulled out of it. Standing there with his hands on the hood, he felt strangely separate from the people moving past him, like he had been placed in a glass box that no one else wanted to acknowledge. Officer Hargrove stepped closer again. "Stay still." Caleb nodded slightly. "I am." The officer reached forward once more, pressing Caleb slightly harder against the car as he checked the waistband again. Still nothing. A muscle tightened in Hargrove's jaw. From a distance, a pedestrian stopped briefly near the corner convenience store. The man leaned against a newspaper stand and watched the scene for a moment before lighting a cigarette. His name was Frank Delaney, a construction worker in his early 50s with rough hands and a heavy build from decades of physical labor. Frank had the broad shoulders and sunburned skin of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. Frank squinted toward the flashing lights. He had seen scenes like this before. Most people had. After a few seconds, he exhaled a thin stream of smoke and looked away. "Not my business," he muttered quietly to himself. The cigarette smoke drifted into the air. Officer Hargrove finally stepped back. His hands rested briefly on his utility belt. For a moment, he simply looked at Caleb. The officer's expression had changed slightly. Not softer, just more irritated, as if the situation had not unfolded the way he expected. Caleb slowly lifted his head just enough to look forward, though he kept his hands in place. His arms were beginning to ache slightly from holding the position, but he remained still. In the reflection of the car's hood, Caleb could see the flashing lights of the police cruiser behind him. Red, blue, red again. The colors pulsed across the surface of the metal like a warning signal. The city around them continued moving. Cars passed. Footsteps echoed on the sidewalk. Voices drifted from nearby storefronts. And yet, standing there under the weight of the officer's gaze, Caleb felt something heavy settle inside him. It was not fear, not anger. It was something older. A quiet, familiar exhaustion. The kind that comes from realizing that no matter how calmly you behave, no matter how carefully you live, there are moments when someone has already decided what you are. And nothing you say can change it. Officer Hargrove stared at him for a few seconds longer. Then he spoke again. "Don't move." Caleb didn't. He simply stood there, hands pressed against the hood of the gray sedan, while the city of Cedar Grove flowed around him as if he were invisible. Across Jefferson Avenue, on the opposite side of the intersection, a small city bus stop stood beneath a narrow metal shelter with scratched glass panels. The bench inside had chipped blue paint and a thin layer of dust from weeks without rain. A route map hung crookedly behind the bench, showing faded lines that connected the different corners of the Cedar Grove. Standing there was Lena Whitfield. Lena Whitfield was 29 years old, a graduate student studying social work at Cedar Grove State University. She was of average height, with a slim build and a posture that always seemed attentive, as if she were constantly observing the world around her. Her skin was warm brown, a shade lighter than Caleb's, and her hair was thick and curly, pulled into a loose bun at the back of her head. A few strands had escaped and moved slightly in the afternoon breeze. Her eyes were dark and thoughtful. People who knew Lena often described her as calm, analytical, and quietly compassionate. She was not the kind of person who rushed into arguments or dramatic gestures. Instead, she tended to watch carefully, listen closely, and speak only when she believed it truly mattered. That habit came from her upbringing. Lena's father had been a public defense attorney, a man who spent most of his career representing people who could not afford legal help. His name was Arthur Whitfield, a tall, thoughtful man with silver hair and the patient demeanor of someone who had spent decades inside courtrooms. Arthur believed deeply in fairness and due process, and when Lena was young, he often spoke about justice not as something abstract, but as something fragile, something that required ordinary people to notice when it was being bent. Lena had heard many of those conversations growing up. Some of them had stayed with her. Now she stood beneath the bus stop shelter, holding the strap of her canvas backpack loosely over one shoulder. She had been waiting for the Route 14 bus, which usually arrived around this time each evening to take passengers toward the University District. But when she glanced across the street, something pulled her attention away from the schedule board. It was not the flashing police lights alone. Cedar Grove was not a city where police cars were rare. What caught her attention was the stillness of the man standing beside the gray sedan. From across the street, Lena could see Caleb Morris with his hands pressed flat against the hood of the car. His shoulders were tense but controlled, his head lowered slightly as Officer Hargrove continued searching him. Lena watched carefully. Caleb did not argue. He did not turn around. He did not move suddenly. He simply stood there, and somehow, that quiet compliance made the scene feel even heavier. Beside Lena on the bench sat an older woman named Margaret Doyle. Margaret was in her early 70s, short and slightly round in build, with soft white hair that framed her lined face. She wore a light beige coat and held a small shopping bag resting on her lap. Margaret had lived in Cedar Grove most of her life and spent many afternoons taking the bus between her apartment and the grocery store. Her eyesight was not as sharp as it once had been, but even she noticed the flashing lights across the street. Margaret leaned forward slightly and squinted. "What's going on over there?" she murmured. Lena did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the scene. Officer Hargrove's movements were becoming sharper, more impatient. Each time the officer checked another pocket or seam of Caleb's clothing and found nothing, his frustration seemed to deepen. Margaret followed Lena's gaze. "Oh," she said quietly. "Police stop." There was no anger in her voice, no curiosity either, just the tone of someone who had seen similar moments before. Margaret adjusted the shopping bag in her lap and looked down at the pavement. "Best not to get involved," she added after a moment. Lena felt a faint tension rise in her chest. She continued watching. From where she stood, she could see the angle of Caleb's shoulders, the position of his hands against the car. She noticed how carefully he kept his body still, how controlled every movement seemed. It was the posture of someone who understood the risks of even small misunderstandings. That detail made Lena uneasy. Another person approached the bus stop from down the sidewalk. The newcomer was Trevor Lynn, a college freshman who lived in one of the nearby student apartments. Trevor was 19. Tall and thin with messy black hair and a slightly nervous energy that seemed common among first-year students adjusting to life away from home. He carried a skateboard under one arm and wore headphones around his neck. Trevor slowed when he noticed the police car. "Whoa," he said quietly, glancing across the street. For a moment, he watched the search with the casual curiosity of someone observing an unexpected street scene. Then he shrugged slightly and sat down on the edge of the bench. "Guess someone's having a bad day," he muttered. Lena felt the words settle awkwardly in the air. Her attention returned to Caleb. Officer Hargrove's hands moved again, checking the inside lining of Caleb's jacket. Nothing. Again. Nothing. The officer stepped back briefly. His shoulders were tense. Even from across the street, Lena could sense the irritation building in his posture. A strange thought crossed her mind. The officer looked like someone who had expected to find something. Something that would justify the stop. Something that would confirm his suspicion. But so far, nothing had appeared. Lena shifted slightly under the bus shelter. A quiet debate had begun inside her mind. Part of her wanted to look away. It would have been easy. Most people around the intersection had already done exactly that. Cars passed. Pedestrians moved along the sidewalks. No one stopped. No one asked questions. Another voice in Lena's mind pushed against that instinct. She remembered a conversation from years earlier. She had been 14, sitting at the kitchen table while her father reviewed legal documents late into the night. At one point, she had asked him why so many cases depended on witnesses. Arthur Whitfield had paused for a moment before answering. "Because injustice survives best," he had said calmly, "when the people who see it decide it's safer not to." The memory came back now with surprising clarity. Lena exhaled slowly. She looked again at Caleb standing beside the gray sedan. Still calm, still silent, still being searched. The debate inside her mind narrowed to a simple choice. She could stand here like everyone else, or she could do something small, not confrontation, not interference, just presence. Lena reached into the front pocket of her backpack. Her fingers closed around her phone. For a moment she hesitated. Her heart beat a little faster. "What are you doing?" Trevor asked casually from the bench. Lena glanced at him. "Just recording," she said quietly. Trevor shrugged. "Why?" Lena turned her gaze back toward the street. "Because someone should." She raised the phone slowly, angling it toward the intersection. From this distance, the scene was still clearly visible. The gray sedan, the police cruiser, Officer Hargrove standing near Caleb. Lena pressed the record button. The camera began capturing the moment. Not dramatically, not heroically, just steadily. Across the street, the search continued. The officer checked another pocket. Another seam. Another empty space. Cars passed between Lena and the scene, briefly interrupting the view before moving on. Still, she kept the phone raised. The recording light blinked softly on the screen. Lena did not say anything. She did not step forward. She simply stood there beneath the quiet shelter of the bus stop, holding the camera steady, watching, making sure the moment did not disappear unnoticed. Officer Daniel Hargrove stepped back from Caleb Morris at last. The search had taken longer than he expected, and the growing quiet around the intersection seemed to press in on him. The officer's hands rested briefly on his utility belt as he scanned Caleb once more, his sharp gray eyes moving over the man as if he might still discover something that justified the entire stop. But there was nothing. No weapon, no drugs, no stolen property, nothing illegal. Only a tired warehouse worker standing beside an aging gray sedan under the fading afternoon light. Hargrove straightened his back, his shoulders tightening slightly beneath the dark blue fabric of his uniform. For a moment he said nothing. His lips pressed together into a thin line, the expression of a man who had expected confirmation and instead found emptiness. To anyone watching closely, the emotion on his face was not relief. It was irritation. Caleb remained still, his palms still touching the hood of the car, though the officer had already stepped away. His arms were stiff from holding the position so long, but he waited until Hargrove spoke before moving. The officer reached toward Caleb's wrists. Earlier in the stop, Hargrove had briefly secured plastic restraint cuffs around them while continuing the search, a precaution he had not bothered to explain. Now the officer pulled a small cutting tool from his belt and snapped the restraints with two short, impatient motions. The plastic ties fell to the pavement near Caleb's feet. The sound was soft, but it carried a strange finality. Hargrove's voice followed a moment later. "Next time," he said flatly, "remember to cooperate." The words were delivered with the tone of someone offering advice, but the meaning beneath them was unmistakable. It was not guidance, it was warning. Caleb lowered his arms slowly and flexed his fingers once as the circulation returned. He did not argue. He did not ask questions. Instead, he simply nodded once, the movement small and controlled. "Understood," he said quietly. The officer studied him for another moment, perhaps waiting for anger or resistance that never appeared. Then Hargrove turned away. The police cruiser's lights still flashed behind them, washing the street in alternating red and blue. The officer walked back toward the car with steady steps, his boots striking the pavement with the same measured rhythm as before. At the edge of the sidewalk, a city sanitation worker paused beside a parked garbage truck. His name was Carl Benson, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s with rough hands and a heavy build shaped by decades of physical labor. Carl wore a reflective orange safety vest over a gray work shirt and held a pair of thick work gloves in one hand. His hair was thinning and streaked with gray, and his expression carried the tired patience of someone who had seen many things in the city and rarely felt surprised anymore. Carl had watched most of the encounter from across the street while emptying a public trash bin. Now he shook his head once, quietly. "Nothing again," he muttered under his breath. Beside the garbage truck sat a large, black and white stray dog that had been wandering the neighborhood for several months. The dog, known by local workers as Patch, was an old mixed-breed animal with a patch of white fur across one eye and a scar along his flank from a long-healed injury. Patch had learned to linger near places where people sometimes shared food scraps, and he had become a familiar sight near Jefferson Avenue. The dog watched the police cruiser carefully, ears twitching at the flashing lights. Animals often sensed tension before people did. Patch stood slowly, stretched his legs, and trotted a few steps away from the curb. Officer Hargrove reached his cruiser and opened the door. Before getting inside, he cast one last glance back toward Caleb. It was a quick look, but it carried the same cold calculation that had marked the beginning of the stop. Then the officer climbed into the driver's seat. The cruiser's engine rumbled to life. A second later, the flashing lights switched off. The sudden absence of color made the street look strangely ordinary again. The police car pulled away from the curb and merged back into traffic, driving slowly down Jefferson Avenue before turning at the next corner. Within moments, the vehicle disappeared. Just like that, as if the entire encounter had been nothing more than a brief interruption. Traffic resumed its natural rhythm. Cars passed through the intersection. A bus rolled by with its brakes hissing softly as it approached the stop down the street. The city continued moving forward with the quiet indifference of a place where moments like this were rarely remembered for long. Caleb remained standing beside his car. For several seconds he did not move. His shoulders sagged slightly as the tension left his body. He rested one hand against the side of the sedan and looked down at the pavement near his shoes. In the reflection of the car's window, he could see his own face. The expression there was not anger. It was something deeper. A tired sadness that seemed older than the moment itself, the kind of sadness that comes from experiencing the same pattern too many times. From across the street, Lena Whitfield lowered her phone slowly. The recording had captured everything. The search, the officer's frustration, the quiet release. Her hand trembled slightly, though she had kept the camera steady while filming. Trevor Lynn had already boarded the bus when it arrived a minute earlier. Margaret Doyle had followed him aboard, still clutching her grocery bag. The bus doors closed with a mechanical hiss, and the vehicle pulled away, leaving the bus shelter nearly empty. Lena stood alone now. For a moment she hesitated. Then she crossed the street. Her steps were careful but steady as she approached the gray sedan. Up close, Caleb looked taller than she had realized from a distance. The lines of fatigue in his face were more visible too, especially around his eyes. She stopped a few feet away. Neither of them spoke immediately. The traffic light above the intersection changed again. Green, yellow, red. Lena lowered her phone to her side. "I saw everything," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. Caleb turned his head slightly toward her. Their eyes met for the first time. For a moment he seemed uncertain how to respond. Then he gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said softly. "Not thank you for filming. Not thank you for intervening. Simply thank you for seeing." Lena did not say anything else. She understood that sometimes acknowledgement was enough. Caleb opened the driver's door and slid back into the seat. The familiar smell of the car's interior greeted him. Faint traces of motor oil, fabric cleaner, and the lingering scent of coffee from a cup he had finished hours earlier. He placed both hands on the steering wheel. For a moment he simply sat there. Then he started the engine. The old sedan hummed quietly to life. Outside, Jefferson Avenue looked exactly the same as it had 20 minutes earlier. But for Caleb Morris, the afternoon had changed something small and difficult to describe. He pulled the car away from the curb and drove slowly forward, merging back into the flow of traffic. Behind him, the intersection returned to its ordinary rhythm. Several weeks passed after the afternoon on Jefferson Avenue. Autumn in Cedar Grove slowly deepened, and the city settled into its familiar rhythm again. Leaves gathered along sidewalks, and the cool air carried the scent of damp pavement after light evening rains. Most people who had driven past the flashing police lights that day had already forgotten the moment entirely. In a city that moved quickly, memory often faded just as quickly, but the moment had not disappeared completely. One evening in her small apartment near the University District, Lena Whitfield sat at a narrow wooden desk beneath a yellow reading lamp. The room was modest but tidy. Bookshelves filled with textbooks on social work, psychology, and criminal justice lined one wall, while a small potted fern rested near the window. Outside, traffic murmured faintly from the street below. Lena stared at the screen of her laptop. The video she had recorded that day played silently in the corner of the screen. The image was steady but simple. Caleb standing beside the gray sedan, Officer Hargrove searching him, the flashing police lights reflecting across the pavement. She had hesitated before sharing it. For several days, the video stayed only on her phone. She replayed it occasionally, wondering what to do. Lena had never been someone who chased attention or public arguments online, but each time she watched the clip, the same thought returned. If she said nothing, the moment would vanish. Eventually, she uploaded the video to a small community discussion forum used by Cedar Grove residents. The website was run by a local journalist named Marcus Hale, a thoughtful man in his early 40s who had spent most of his career writing about neighborhood issues rather than national headlines. Marcus was tall and lean, with deep-set eyes and dark hair that had begun to gray at the temples. People who worked with him described him as patient and careful with facts, someone who preferred quiet investigation over sensational stories. When Marcus saw the video posted on the forum, he watched it twice, then a third time. What caught his attention was not drama. It was clarity. The footage was calm, steady, and difficult to misinterpret. A man standing quietly, a search that grew increasingly frustrated. A release with no explanation. Marcus contacted Lena through the forum message system. He asked permission to verify and share the video as part of a short article about police stops in Cedar Grove. Lena thought about it carefully. Then she agreed. Within a few days, the clip appeared on the local news website beside Marcus Hale's article. The headline was simple and restrained. Video raises questions about traffic stop on Jefferson Avenue. The story did not accuse, it did not exaggerate. It simply described what could be seen. The video spread slowly from there. Not viral, not explosive, but steady. Residents shared it across social media pages and neighborhood groups. Some watched silently. Others debated what it meant. Some defended the officer, others questioned the stop. But the most important thing was this. The moment now existed on record. Inside the Cedar Grove Police Department, the video eventually reached the desk of Captain Eleanor Price, the officer responsible for reviewing internal conduct reports. Eleanor Price was a woman in her mid-50s with short, silver-streaked hair and a composed, disciplined manner that reflected more than 30 years in law enforcement. She had begun her career as a patrol officer before rising slowly through the department's ranks. Unlike some administrators who preferred quiet resolutions, Price had developed a reputation for methodical fairness. She believed strongly that public trust depended on transparency. Captain Price watched the video in her office one morning while sipping black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. The footage ended. She leaned back in her chair and remained silent for several seconds. Then she made a call. An internal review was opened. The process was slow and procedural. Forms were filed, statements were requested. Patrol logs from that afternoon were examined. Officer Hargrove was asked to submit an explanation for the stop. No announcements were made. No headlines declared victory. But within the department, the matter had begun moving through official channels. Officer Daniel Hargrove received notice that he was being temporarily reassigned to administrative duties while the review took place. The reassignment meant long hours at a desk instead of patrol work, reviewing paperwork and assisting with routine reports. Hargrove did not argue publicly, but colleagues who saw him in the station noticed the tension in his expression whenever the topic surfaced. Meanwhile, life for Caleb Morris continued in much the same way as before. Each morning, he drove the same gray sedan across town toward the warehouse where he worked. The building stood at the edge of the industrial district, a wide metal structure surrounded by loading docks and stacks of shipping pallets. Inside, the steady noise of forklifts and conveyor belts filled the air. One afternoon during a break, Caleb sat on a wooden crate near the loading bay beside a coworker named Marcus Reed. Marcus was a broad-shouldered man in his early 30s with deep brown skin and a short beard that framed his serious expression. Known among the warehouse staff as dependable and straightforward, Marcus had grown up in Cedar Grove and understood the quiet tensions that sometimes moved beneath the surface of daily life in the city. Marcus had seen the video online the night before. He leaned against a stack of boxes and looked toward Caleb. "That you in that clip?" Marcus asked quietly. Caleb nodded once. "Yeah." Marcus exhaled slowly. That officer looked like he expected something. Caleb gave a small, tired smile. He did. Neither man said more. The brake bell rang and they returned to work. But later that evening, something shifted quietly inside Caleb. After finishing his shift, he drove not directly home, but toward a small community center located near the downtown library. The building was older, built of red brick with tall windows and a faded sign above the door that read Cedar Grove Civic Resource Center. Inside, a meeting room had been arranged with several folding tables and rows of metal chairs. At the front stood Professor Alan Rodriguez, a middle-aged community advocate who volunteered to teach evening classes about civil rights and legal awareness. Rodriguez was a calm man with warm brown eyes and neatly combed salt and pepper hair. Years earlier, he had worked as a legal aid attorney before transitioning into community education. His speaking style was thoughtful and measured, more like a teacher than a lawyer. About a dozen people sat scattered around the room. Some were college students. Some were local residents. All of them listened as Rodriguez spoke about the rights citizens held during police encounters. Caleb sat quietly near the back row. He listened. He took notes. Not because he wanted confrontation, not because he wanted attention, but because something inside him had changed slightly after the stop on Jefferson Avenue. For the first time, he wanted to understand the rules clearly enough that he could stand in moments like that without uncertainty. He wanted knowledge, and maybe someday, the ability to help someone else avoid standing alone in the same position. When the class ended, Caleb walked outside into the cool evening air. The city lights reflected softly on the pavement. He paused beside his gray sedan and looked up at the darkening sky above Cedar Grove. The city had not changed. The streets were the same. The traffic lights still switched between red and green as always. But something had shifted, quietly. For once, silence had not been the final chapter of the story. Several months passed in Cedar Grove, and winter had quietly begun to loosen its grip on the city. The cold mornings were slowly giving way to mild afternoons, and the streets carried the familiar sounds of everyday life returning after the long season of gray skies and early sunsets. Jefferson Avenue looked much the same as it always had. Rows of small shops, bus stops with scratched metal benches and traffic lights that shifted rhythmically between red, yellow, and green. For most people, it was just another intersection. But for Caleb Morris, it had once been something else. On a calm afternoon in early spring, Caleb's old gray sedan rolled down Jefferson Avenue once again. The car had gained a few more scratches since the winter months, and the engine carried the faint rattle of a vehicle that had seen many miles. But it still ran steadily, just as it had the day everything began. Caleb himself looked slightly different, too. He was still tall and lean, still carrying the quiet composure that had always defined him. But the months of evening classes and community meetings had sharpened something in his posture. The calm patience in his expression now carried a subtle confidence, a quiet understanding of his rights and his place in the world. Not arrogance, not defiance. Just clarity. Inside the car, the soft sound of a jazz radio station played from the dashboard speakers. Caleb's hands rested lightly but firmly on the steering wheel as he approached the familiar intersection with Maple Street. The traffic light ahead turned red. Caleb eased his foot onto the brake and stopped at the white line. The engine idled gently beneath him. He glanced briefly through the windshield at the crosswalk ahead, watching a few pedestrians move across the street. One of them was Derek Collins, a middle-aged mail carrier with a sturdy build and a permanent tan from years of walking neighborhood delivery routes. Derek wore the familiar blue postal uniform and carried a leather mail bag slung over one shoulder. His steady pace and relaxed posture reflected someone who had spent decades navigating the same streets without much excitement. Derek crossed the intersection without noticing Caleb. The light remained red. Caleb waited. Months earlier, this moment would have tightened something inside him. Now it simply felt like another pause in traffic. Across the street, the bus shelter stood in its usual place, the glass panels still scratched, and the faded route map still hanging crookedly against the wall. A few people waited there for the afternoon bus. Among them stood Lena Whitfield. Lena looked almost exactly as she had the day of the traffic stop, though her hair was shorter now, trimmed into a neat curl that framed her face. She wore a dark green coat and carried a thick notebook tucked under one arm. Notes from her graduate research on community advocacy and public accountability. The months since that day had changed her slightly as well. After the video circulated and the department review began, Lena had received messages from several local organizations interested in her research. One of her professors had even encouraged her to develop a study on how community witnesses influence public accountability. Lena had not expected the moment on Jefferson Avenue to become part of her academic work, but sometimes life wrote its own research topics. As she stood beneath the shelter, Lena glanced up from her notebook toward the street. Her eyes moved across the intersection casually. Then she noticed the gray sedan. For a second, she simply watched. The memory returned instantly. The flashing police lights. The search. The quiet moment afterward. But today the scene was different. The traffic light turned green. No sirens, no flashing lights, no patrol car. Just the ordinary signal that drivers see thousands of times every year. Caleb pressed the gas pedal gently. The sedan rolled forward. From the stop, Lena raised her hand slightly in a small wave of recognition. It was not dramatic, just a simple greeting between two people who shared a memory. Caleb noticed the movement. For a moment, he looked toward the shelter. Their eyes met briefly through the distance of the intersection. Caleb nodded once. A small smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. It was not the wide smile of celebration. Just a quiet acknowledgement. A moment of mutual understanding. The car continued through the intersection. Behind the bus shelter sat another quiet observer. Mr. Harold Benson, an elderly man who often spent afternoons feeding pigeons in the small plaza beside the bus stop. Harold was 78 years old, thin and slightly stooped from age, with silver hair that curled gently above his ears. His coat was old but carefully maintained, and his gentle demeanor had made him a familiar presence in the neighborhood. Harold tossed a handful of breadcrumbs toward a cluster of pigeons near the sidewalk. One of the birds, a gray pigeon with a small patch of white feathers on its neck, fluttered briefly before settling near his shoes. Harold smiled softly as he watched the birds gather. From where he sat, he noticed the gray sedan passing through the green light. To Harold, it was just another car. Another moment in the quiet rhythm of the city. But for Caleb, driving down Jefferson Avenue, the moment carried a different meaning. The road ahead stretched open and calm. Traffic flowed normally. No flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. The steering wheel felt steady beneath his hands. The city had not transformed overnight. People still hurried through their days. Questions about fairness and justice still existed. But something important had happened once on this street. A moment had been witnessed, recorded, acknowledged. And because of that, it had not vanished into silence. Caleb drove past the intersection and continued down Jefferson Avenue, the sunlight reflecting softly across the windshield. Behind him, the traffic light changed again. Green, then yellow, then red, just as it always had. But the meaning of that green light felt clearer now. For Caleb Morris, it meant something simple, something ordinary. The road ahead was open, and this time nothing stood in the way of moving forward. Every story leaves something behind for us to think about. The story of Caleb Morris is not only about one traffic stop on one afternoon in Cedar Grove, it is about something much quieter and much more familiar in everyday life. Most of us will never stand on the side of a road with flashing lights behind us, but almost everyone has experienced a moment when they felt judged, misunderstood, or treated unfairly. And just as important, many of us have also been the person standing nearby, watching something happen and wondering whether we should speak, step forward, or simply walk away. What makes this story meaningful is not that someone fought back with anger. It is that someone chose awareness instead of silence. Caleb did not shout. He did not seek revenge. Instead, he chose knowledge, patience, and dignity. He decided to learn more about his rights and how to help others. That choice shows us that strength is not always loud. Sometimes the strongest response to injustice is the decision to grow wiser and stand taller the next time life tests us. And Lena reminds us of another powerful truth. She did not rush in to argue or create chaos. She simply paid attention and recorded what she saw so the truth would not disappear. In everyday life, many problems continue because no one is willing to see them clearly. Sometimes the most meaningful action is simply refusing to look away. This story also gently reminds us that how we treat one another matters more than we often realize. Every person we meet is carrying a life we cannot see, struggles we do not understand, and dignity that deserves respect. A kinder word, a fairer judgment, or even a moment of patience can shape someone else's day more than we think. In our daily lives, we all stand at intersections like the one on Jefferson Avenue. Sometimes the light is red and we must wait. Sometimes it turns green and we move forward. But the direction of our lives is also shaped by the choices we make toward other people. Choose fairness when you can. Choose patience when things are tense. Choose courage when silence would be easier. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to share it with someone who might need the same reminder today. Stories like this grow stronger when people pass them forward. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from today, and share one thing you believe people should remember about treating others with dignity. If you believe that truth matters, that quiet courage matters, and that even small acts of awareness can make the world a little better, please consider subscribing to this channel so more stories like this can reach more people. And if you believe that kindness and justice still matter in our world, write Amen in the comments. May God bless everyone watching today. May He protect you, guide your steps, and give you the wisdom to treat others with fairness and compassion wherever you go.